Vladimir Georgievich Vinnichevskiy, the youngest serial killer in the USSR, sentenced to death and shot by court order. Vladimir was guilty of 18 attacks on kids between the ages of 2 to 4 years old from 1938 to 1939 in Sverdlovsk, Nizhniy Tagil and Kuvsha, 8 of which ended in murder. Vinnichevskiy was sentenced to death and executed on November 11, 1940. He was only 17 years young. Vladimir was born in 1923. His father, Georgy Ivanovich, was a master in the municipal services of Sverdlovsk. His mother, Elizaveta Petrovna, and an accountant. The family lived in a separate private house in the center of Sverdlovsk. The Vinnichevskiy family were counted as rich. Vladimir had a suit, tank helmet, a Swiss pocket knife, and leather shoes. Vinnichevskiy also had a pocket money. During his arrest, more than 20 rubles were found in his belongings. Back then, it was a 2-day wage of a worker. Vinnichevskiy himself was in 7th grade and studied in the school number 16 of Sverdlovsk. His progress was low and Vladimir had to stay in the same grade and redo 1 year. However, Vinnichevskiy sang well and knew many songs by heart. Vladimir was good friend with Ernst Nizhniy, who became a famous sculptor. Him and Vinnichevskiy were in the same grade in school. Vladimir was 2 years older than Nizhniy, but went to school a year later and stayed in the same grade for 1 year. The teens lived close to each other and went to school together, watched movies and attended performances in the theater of musical comedy. Vinnichevskiy often visited the Nizhniy family's apartment. During the interrogations on 17th of November in 1939, Ernst described Vinnichevskiy like so. "I can say that he was a humble guy, shy, liked to be alone. In school he often would come to a corner and just stand there. While being with him, I talked about girls, but he always spoke of them with some sort of disgust and said that he doesn't like the idea of relationships and never had any. I personally often noticed that when he left to go to the restroom, he always stayed there for quite a while, but I don't know what he did there." It is unknown when Vladimir committed his first murder, since the detectives couldn't find the relatives of the first victims according to Vinnichevskiy testimony. In order to commit the crimes, the criminal walked around telling a made-up story about that he, as part of Komsomol order, organized the collection of scrap metal for the pioneer crew, and therefore is walking around apartments asking who of the residents have scrap metal. The first episode, more precisely the third, but the investigation didn't receive any information regarding the first two, was the murder of 4-year-old Gerta Gribanova, committed in the summer of early autumn of 1938 in Sverdlovsk. Vinnichevskiy entered a yard of a private house where the Gribanov family lived, took the girl into the garden where he strangled her and then stabbed Gerta 8 times using a knife and broke it, leaving a fragment in the skull. Vinnichevskiy got rid of the broken knife and in the future he used a screwdriver and a folding knife to commit crimes. Even though most of Vinnichevskiy's attacks were committed in Sverdlovsk, he also occasionally traveled to other cities in Sverdlovsk region. One attack happened in Nizhniy Tagil and one in Kuvsha. Vinnichevskiy attacked both girls and boys. His motive of the attacks was to force the victims into sexual intercourse. At first, Vinnichevskiy tried to perform a natural sexual intercourse with the female victims, but became convinced that due to anatomical limitations, this was impossible to do. Then he began to perform unnatural acts, and in some cases, usually in the cold season, he just rubbed against the body. After finishing the act, Vinnichevskiy usually strangled his victims, but sometimes beat the victims to death with a cold weapon. The murder of Gerta Gribanova gave the detectives a clue: the girl's skull with a fragment of a broken knife stuck in it. The most terrifying thing is that the girl's head was detached from the body by the investigators in order to leave it as a clue, and the remains of the body were given back to the parents for burial. The assumption was that the killer would use the same kitchen knife again, with which he killed Gribanova. However, this theory did not come true. Vinnichevskiy's 5th victim became a boy, who most likely survived, but he wasn't found. Then the killer invited 4-year-old Borya Titov to go sledding, drove him to an empty lot where he dumped his body into snow after the attack on him. Vinnichevskiy took his sleds with him. Borya was saved and was the one who gave the first information about the killer to the police. Vinnichevsky's seventh attack was on 3-year-old Katya Lobanova in Kushva. He killed the girl and threw away the body into a buried pit in order to cover the scent of decomposition. In Sverdlovsk, Vinnichevsky began to take kids to forests on the outskirts of the city, killed them there, and hid the bodies with branches. Exactly like this, Lida Surina and Valya Kamaeva, who were 4-year-old, were killed in the spring of 1939. After Alia Gubina was kidnapped, she just turned 3 years old. The killer wounded the girl using a knife. After this, he left the girl alone, but she survived, since her relatives quickly began to look for her. Vinnichevsky selected his victims only on the outskirts, but not too far from his house. Vinnichevsky kidnapped 2 more kids on the Mamina Sibiriaka street. The detectives noticed that he didn't drag the victims more than a kilometer away from the place where he found them. This observation came in handy and helped save some of the victims. The last victim, Taisia Morozova, was undressed by Vinnichevsky. He threw her body into a pit and her clothes into a front garden of a residential building, thinking that the body would be searched for there. The wounded victims of Vinnichevsky that were thrown into pits practically didn't have any chances to be saved, even if they were still alive. However, Raya Rakhmatulina, who was thrown into the pit by Vinnichevsky, woke up, started to scream, and she was saved. The Sverdlovsk Criminal Investigation Department experienced difficulties in investigating the cases of kidnapping. The episodes differed, different places and different methods of getting rid of the body. Besides that, the survivors couldn't give a detailed description of the criminal's appearance. Some parents of the victims didn't go to the police. With all that, the detectives made several false assumptions about the killer's identity. For example, everyone was certain that the killer had previously been convicted, and, as it was assumed, for crimes against sexual integrity. It was also assumed that the killer was 20 to 25 years old, but looked like a teenager. According to one version, the killer was a disabled or seriously ill person. Only in the summer of 1939, all of the existing cases of murders in Sverdlovsk were combined into one case. However, the investigation did not connect the attacks committed by Vinnichevsky in Kushva and Nizhniy Tagil. In 1939, undercover police patrols flooded the whole city of Sverdlovsk, and more than 300 people were arrested. On October 24, 1939, right during a crime, Vinnichevsky was arrested by 3 cadets of the Sverdlovsk Christian Police School, Popov, Angelov, and Krylov. Vinnichevsky took Slava Volkov away from the entrance of the house in which he lived. He got on the tram with the boy, drove to the Medny Rudnik stop on the outskirts of the Uralmash district, and carried the sleeping child in his arms to the nearby forest. The cadets, who had previously participated in patrols and were familiar with the orientation towards the kidnapper, discreetly followed the suspicious teenager. Vinnichevsky was arrested right at the moment when he started to choke the boy, previously unbuttoning the collar of the boy's coat. Thus, Slava Volkov was saved, and the criminal lost the opportunity to come up with a plausible non-criminal explanation for his actions, since during the strangulation attempt, he left clearly visible nail marks on the victim's neck. During the investigation, Vinnichevsky admitted his guilt in all of the murders, and it turned out that he recorded all of the episodes on paper, encrypting the text. Vinnichevsky's parents brought a statement to the regional paper Uralsky Rabochi with the following content: "We, as parents, renounce such a son and demand that the highest measure be applied to him, execution. There can be no life for such bastards in a Soviet family." Doctor of Juridical Sciences Smikalin emphasizes that the trial of the Vinnichevsky took place when the Soviet law didn't restrict death penalties for minors who had reached the age of 12. On January 16, 1940, Vinnichevsky has sentenced to execution by the court. The convict filed a petition for forgiveness in which he claimed that he is ready to earn forgiveness in a battle and expressed desire to become a tanker, since at that time the USSR was fighting against Finland. By request of his lawyer, Vinnichevsky was assigned a psychiatric examination at the Serbsky hospital. The examination found Vinnichevsky sane, and on the 5th of August 1940, a second court session was held in his case, which again pronounced a death sentence. On August 28, 1940, Vinnichevskiy filed another complaint to the Presidium of the Supreme Court of the RSFSR in which he admits his crimes, but begs for mercy and asks to save his life. His relatives remembered that once supposedly brave Vinnichevskiy, when asked if he was not afraid to return home late night, calmly replied, "Anyway, one day everyone has to die." But immediately after the verdict, the maniac's braveness disappeared. Vinnichevskiy was refused in his request for mercy, and on November 11, 1940, at the age of 17, he was shot. In the USSR, the bodies of the executed were not given back to relatives for burial, but instead were buried in special secret places. Probably Vinnichevskiy was buried at the 12th kilometer of the Moscow Tract. This is the only known burial place of those executed in the Sverdlovsk region in the 1930s. During the burial of the executed, the Soviet authorities did not divide them according to the articles for which they were sentenced to death. Therefore, in one mass grave, they were executed both for political reasons and under criminal articles, like Vinnichevskiy. In the 1990s, the burial site at the 12th kilometer of the Moscow Tract was turned into a memorial complex in memory of the victims of the repressions of the 1920s-1950s. On November 20, 2017, a monument, Masks of Sorrow, Europe-Asia, was opened at this complex by the sculptor Ernst Nizhniy, a former school friend of Vinnichevskiy. The criminal case of Vinnichevskiy has number 434. According to the response of the State Archive of the Sverdlovsk region, 4 volumes of the criminal case against Vinnichevskiy Vladimir Georgievich, considered by the Sverdlovsk Regional Court in 1940, were transferred to the archive in 1991 and have been in the public domain ever since. The Museum of the Main Directorate of the Ministry of International Affairs of Russia for the Sverdlovsk region has a photo exhibition dedicated to Vinnichevskiy. Seminars are held there to train future lawyers. In January of 2018, Rakitin, in the format of a book by request, published a 2-volume novel dedicated to Vinnichevskiy under the name Ural Monster, the chronicles of exposing the most mysterious killer of the Soviet Union. In this book, the author proposed a conspiracy theory that Vinnichevskiy had an accomplice. Soon, the book was taken down from shelves and has since been distributed by the author free of charge in electronic form. In 2019, as part of the series The Investigation was conducted, a documentary film, The Devil in Flesh, was shot about Vinnichevskiy. I recommend it to everyone who is interested in this topic.